In Chapter 3, we'll be explaining and understanding social problems. So we'll look at the importance of carefully thinking through the social problem or problems to be addressed, common mistakes that have been made in the past in defining social problems, a more productive way of defining social problems, how standards are used in defining problems, and how a social problem can be better understood and more clearly defined by answering a series of questions about the problem and the population affected. Specific topics that will be covered are addressing social problems, stating them as solutions and the limitations of this approach, the need for a new approach, identifying a social condition, defining problems, including social problems and standards, and frameworks for problem analysis. So when we think about addressing social problems, programs are often justified based on meeting the needs of a target or client population. Programs must develop a clear focus on client need because meeting the need is often the barometer for measuring program integrity, cost efficiency, and cost effectiveness. So as we think about addressing these various problems, we have to look at a planning process. So problem analysis and needs assessment, formulation of a policy framework expressed in goals and objectives, the selection and implementation of an intervention or program, calculation of resources needed to implement the program, and management of monitoring, evaluation, and feedback procedures. So stating problems as solutions, this is one approach, but we can also see limitations of this approach when we're looking at planning, specifically program planning, because the implicit assumption is that the problems are fully understood and their solutions known, which, as we know, a lot of times these social issues are very complex. They're not just completely simple. And so sometimes looking at an approach as stating them as solutions, it may oversimplify what's going on and may actually fail to see some of the complexity of the problem itself. The common denominator is a strong belief that the major problem is basically a lack of resources. And again, that may not always be true. We know what to do and would be able to solve most, if not all, problems if we had sufficient resources. And again, that's not always the case. And so that's some of the limitation that we see here, because there may be specific blinders to other issues, social issues, issues within the community that are maintaining the problem. Again, limitations to this approach: business as usual with additional resources risks taking program planning in an unproductive direction. Fresh analysis of conditions and problems may result in different interventions or programs. And so again, it's important for us to understand as fully as possible these social problems, and by understanding and being able to define them clearly, it also gives us a better course of action in terms of developing interventions. Okay, again, limitations to this approach: stating problems as solutions, emphasizes organizational survival or program maintenance and expansion. Services initially introduced as possible mechanisms to assist people in need because, and they become the only way to do things. And so again, there may be this lack of evaluation that occurs there. And then this focuses on the existing service delivery system, emphasizing management aspects, the efficiency of the system, not the effectiveness of the system. And so again, it leaves out a key piece, or potentially leaves out a key piece to being able to actually solve some of these social issues. Okay. When we try to be a bit more critical in terms of understanding social problems, some of the considerations are that problem analysis should be the first of a series of related activities in the planning process. Problem analysis initially should focus on understanding the problem, not on generating the solutions, and a problem analysis should involve a fresh look at issues free of assumptions about services. So looking at the need for a new approach, just comparing these two things, the business as usual approach, we see that existing services based on a traditional understanding of the problem. We see growing numbers of people in need in the community, and then request for increased funding or existing services. If we compare that to the analytical approach, we see that problem analysis is based on existing theory and research. So again, we have that empirical piece here, this evidence-based piece, the current profile of those in need in the community, and so that leads more to the approaches to service based on new and current understandings of problem and need. Okay, identifying a social condition. We begin with an understanding of the condition or facts or statistical representation of the phenomenon under study. We follow with an understanding of the problem itself. The concept social problem needs to be understood as relative. An individual brings a frame of reference shaped by a value system to a condition and labels a condition a problem. Conditions can be defined as social facts. And if you're interested in trying to look up data about specific populations, or you're trying to understand a problem in this way, resources like the Pew Research Center, NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, the CDC, depending on what type of condition you're looking at or researching, there are some valuable governmental resources to get statistical data. Defining problems. An inadequately defined problem is unlikely to be solved. A well-defined problem may be successfully addressed, assuming adequate resources are made available and appropriate services are provided. And so this always reminds me when people are saying that they're trying to recover from a specific issue, it's like the first step to recovery or to intervention or to being successful is admitting that you have a problem or recognizing that. But it's also important for us to understand the nature of the problem itself. And again, as we mentioned, defining or having a well-defined problem or defining it in a really effective way is using evidence that's out there, is looking at research that's out there, is kind of pouring through various resources to understand that. Okay, social problems and standards. Move from fact to problem to bring some standard to assessing the individual situation. Go beyond the absolute definition and demonstrate how a situation is related to a number of other conditions. Conditions become problems when they are judged to be negative, harmful, or pathological. There's a need to take all perspectives on social conditions into account during the planning process. And culture has a big, plays a large role in this too, in the understanding of culture, because we see that various practices or various ways of defining social situations may either be deemed as problematic or not, oftentimes based on these things that are typical to culture. So it's important to understand that as well. Okay, so our frameworks for problem analysis, and this will be all wrapped up in one chart or figure that we can look at as well, but number one, what's the nature of the situation or condition? Collect facts and impressions from many different perspectives and ensure that all are considered so that the problem is not labeled prematurely. Step two, how are the terms defined? Common understandings must be achieved on all terms so that there is a shared definition of the problem and the target population. Step three, what are the characteristics of those experiencing the condition? Describe those experiencing the problem in socio-demographic terms. What is the scale and distribution of the condition? Estimate the numbers affected and the spatial distribution of the condition under study. Item 5. What social values are being threatened by the existence of the condition? Explore how people in the community would respond to the presence of the condition if they knew that it existed. Community perspectives are critical in determining whether a condition is seen as a problem to be addressed. Step 6. How widely is the condition recognized? You need to have an idea of potential community support for action. If the condition is not widely recognized, there may be a need for community education before an intervention can even be implemented. Step 7, who defines the condition as a problem? Who would support and who would oppose resolution of the condition? It includes an analysis not only of who, what, and where, but also the political environment. Whenever money is involved, there is competition for scarce resources, which leads to opposition. And so it's important for us to be aware of that and to be realistic. Step 8, what is the etiology of the problem? Interventions that target the causes of the problem will result in positive outcomes. An epidemiological approach is helpful in determining etiology. It hypothesizes the existence of causal chains and assumes that if a link in that chain can be altered or broken, the problem can be addressed, at least with partial success. Speculating about etiology of multi-causal social problems is dependent on available information that influences accuracy and validity of knowledge of cause and effect. And finally, step 9, are there ethnic and gender considerations? We need to be aware of the ways in which the problem and the proposed intervention will affect and be affected by ethnic and gender considerations. Also, you could read into this culture, and that extends beyond just ethnicity and gender, but think about differing physical abilities that people may have. Think about religion, spiritual aspects that may play a role. So we have to consider, I would say, cultural considerations here. Okay, and so again, this is our kind of wrap up the chart here or the figure here that looks at these different steps. You see that this process is cyclical, so it's something that's constantly being assessed, and it's dynamic, and the nature of these conditions can change. And so we're assessing our, as our last step is we're assessing culture, And as working through each of these 9 steps, we are continually being dynamic in terms of how we're looking at that. So again, just to reiterate, item 1, define the nature of the condition. 2, how are terms being defined? 3, determine characteristics of the population. 4, determine scale and distribution. 5, determine social values being threatened. 6, determine degree of recognition. 7, determine who defines the problem. 8, determine the etiology. And 9, assess ethnic and gender considerations. And so again, these are just some of the basics in terms of how do we actually define these social problems? How do we make sure that we're using evidence that is available to us? And how are we applying that evidence to understanding conditions and being aware of all of the different stakeholders within the community who may play a role in our ability to design programs and manage them effectively?